So, hello everyone. My name is Max Delmar, and on behalf of no less than 3 research centres, so it's the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context, the Centre for the History of the Emotions, and the Criminal Justice Centre here at Queen Mary, a warm welcome to everyone to this special event on Monika Fludernik's Metaphors of Confinement, the Prison in Fact, Fiction, and Fantasy. The range of interests of those 3 centres alone could give you a sense of the breadth and complexity of this book. Perhaps the size and volume of it will as well. But only really a sense, because this is a book that brings together an enormous array of disciplines and literatures. The result of well over a decade's work, I think much longer even in germination, by one of the world's leading scholars of literature. This book is an incredibly rich exploration of the carceral imaginary across time, of the persistence of certain images, of confinement, incarceration, of being bound, fettered, chained, and the resonance and reappearance of these images in sometimes very surprising contexts. Of their role in how we make sense, including emotional sense, of a range of experiences so beyond imprisonment, for example, of our bodies, our homes, our relationships, and of the significance of these images in producing and then reproducing across generations certain kinds of attitudes, ethical and political attitudes, with all kinds of implications and consequences. It is indeed astonishing what this book weaves together, what it puts on the table for us to examine as a whole, and how it makes us reflect, certainly how it made me reflect. It was a very unique experience to read this book, being confined during COVID, to reflect on prison languages and their related overlapping, sometimes fused fantasies and realities. For those of us who know Monika's work, we are almost used to being astonished by the range of her interests and equally the significance of her contributions to narratology, to stylistics, to law and literature, to postcolonial studies, 18th century studies. It's a long list. So it's really a very great pleasure and a great honor for us here at Queen Mary to be hosting this celebration and also discussion of her book. And we hope it will be the start of many more conversations, I hope some in person as well. Our time this afternoon is very limited. We're really just dipping our toes into what is a truly monumental book. To help us do that, we have 4 commentators, and their different backgrounds again give us another sense of the many audiences and scholarly domains that this book brings together. I'm not going to be able to do justice to their own impressive achievements. I just want to say a word about each of them in the order in which they'll appear. So first, Hannika Stewart is based in Amsterdam in the Literary and Cultural Analysis Department. She has a special interest in spatial imaginaries, if I can call them that, the carceral, the rural, the peripheral, and the political work they do, with a focus on the Netherlands, the United States, and South Africa. Second, Lindsay is based in Glasgow and is a legal theorist and historian, in particular of criminal law, and has worked on the history of the criminal trial, of theories of responsibility, and more recently on the relation between criminal law and markets. Third, Schwan is also based in Scotland, in Edinburgh and Napier University, where she directs the Centre for Literature and Writing, and has interests, both historical and contemporary, in the representation of crime and imprisonment, in literature as well as film, and an interest too in the work of Michel Foucault, who's an important figure for this book. And I would add also an interest in prison-university partnerships too. And fourth, Norrie, who is based in Warwick, who is a legal scholar with wide interests in socio-legal theory, including theories of justice, responsibility, and punishment, as well as in moral psychology, for instance, guilt, forgiveness, and their relations with transitional justice. So I hope you'll agree with me that it's a really great panel. And I'm very grateful to each of our commentators for making time to do this. Each of our commentators will give a comment of about 10 minutes, which is a very difficult task given the scope of this book. We'll have a brief reply from Monika after the first two comments, and then a little break, and then two more comments with again a reply from Monika, and then some time for general discussion. In terms of general discussion, if I could just invite you all to please write down your questions in the chat. Feel free to do that at any time, and I'll take a note of them and ask a selection on your behalf at the end. That's the aim anyway, and see how things go. And do please make sure to keep yourself muted throughout. But first, I'm going to give the floor to Monika Fludernik, who is going to introduce the book for us. Monika, thank you so much for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Max, for making the symposium possible. It's a wonderful thing, and I'm so grateful to you, and also to all the 4 respondents. And I really look forward to the questions, and of course to the questions of the many, many guests, to whom I would also like to say thank you that they've really joined up. So it's wonderful that over 50 people who have joined up. That's really great. Okay, I have a PowerPoint to share. And here we go. I'd like to start by saying something about why I chose to write this book, what the background is. And I think that may also answer some of the questions that people have had about the book. So the original focus was actually on prisons or prison scenarios in literature and a comparison with prison metaphors. And so there was an original title, Carceral Topography and Metaphorics, a long time ago. So the title kept changing. And I discovered that, of course, there was lots and lots and lots of literature about prison scenarios, but very little on prison metaphors. And so there was this virgin territory that I could talk about. And then I got really interested in real and historical prison conditions, because we had a project in Freiburg with the Max Planck Institute with criminologists together. And so I learned a lot about present day German and American prisons, and got really interested also in the historical background. And one of the things that particularly struck me was what I would call the paradox of the happy prison, which is so common in literary texts, and which is really a topos that serves particular cultural work. One of the, I think, ideas is to make it seem that prison is not all that bad, because you have people who really enjoy it, and they can do their writing in the prison. They can have a very happy time in there. And I think that can be very much compared to the phrase dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which makes it seem that war isn't all that bad, because it's very honorable thing to engage in war. And so I was very interested also in the way in which prisoners use this happy prison trope in order to compensate for the negative experience of prison by trying to get beyond their immediate context. So the ideology in representations of prison scenarios became very, very much something that I was interested in. Now, briefly to say something about Foucault, it's already been mentioned. So obviously Foucault has been a great, great influence, very, very important. And I don't actually want to criticize Foucault, but from my material, some of the things that are constitutive of Foucault are less so for literary texts. So on the one hand, this old versus new prison dichotomy, which is historically quite correct. There is the invention of the penitentiary. It doesn't really appear that important if you look at metaphors because they are more continuous. Secondly, there's also this opposition between the communal cell before the penitentiary and the lonely prisoner in his cell afterwards. And that too in literature is not really the case, because a lot of the early prisoners that we know about were from higher social classes, and they had a cell to themselves, so that we already get an anticipation of some of the problems that were talked about in the Victorian period later on. And the dungeon metaphor, obviously, which is quite omnipresent from medieval times to now, is one which keeps propping up, and it can be revived in certain periods where it becomes extremely important. For instance, nowadays, it's very important for supermax prisons, but it's something which you wonder about. Why is it still there when you don't have dungeons normally in carceral institutions? And the other thing that I noticed was that topoi and images also are found in autobiographies. So people writing about their own prison experiences have recourse to the literary canon and the topoi and metaphor, which they have encountered there when reading about prisons before. So the main reason to focus on metaphor was this virgin territory, but also all of these interesting complications of the Foucault pattern. And what about my ulterior aims? So one of the things that I really discovered is that literature really works differently from other discourses about prisons. And the main difference is that on the whole, literature focuses on countering the othering of the prison inmates. It's pervaded with sympathy for the internal perspective of the prisoner, rather than the perspective of society looking at the prisoner and the prison, although that also happens. So Dickens has both perspectives, for instance. And so literature really supports a culture of toleration, which is against the rejection of the offender. And I was also very interested in the way in which crime and penal policies link up with social and cultural norms and backgrounds. In particular, for instance, that there is this understanding that prisoners must have a lower social standard than people or the poorest people outside prison, which is a recurrent element, and which I discuss in chapter 7, where I talk about the factory as prison and the prison as factory. Finally, I also really, when I wrote this book, started to question the ethics of talking about prison in literature or in art in general. I think this is a general problem which really affects artistic treatment of different very negative elements of life. So for instance, to what extent should literature be about war? To what extent should it be about violence, and so on? And the image on the cover is meant to indicate that, by having a beautiful object, which, however, can also be seen as a prison, or you could also imagine this to be actually a prison inside which you are looking out, and despite the fact that it's a prison, it's also an object of art. So thank you very much for listening to me and for discussing the book. I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Monika. I suppose if this is an image looking out from the book as a kind of prison, very much a happy one, wouldn't it, in that sense? Thank you so much. And Hanneke, could I invite you to offer your comment?
Certainly. Thank you very much, Max. Thank you for putting this event together, for organizing it. I thank you on my own behalf because I'm very happy and honored to be here today, but maybe also on behalf of the potential that this book has in reaching a wider audience, and then the potential it has to further the study of prisons, carcerality in general, and the criminalization of populations across disciplines, because I do think that the book has great potential for that particularly. And of course, Professor Fludernik, thank you for the book. It is truly a gift to anyone really interested in the cultural role of the prison. I can't imagine how much time you have spent on it. Decades is an abstract term in that regard. I think for literary and cultural scholars, the pleasure may be particularly pronounced because of your methodological control is really impressive. And the book's commitment to adding to existing readings of the texts that you study is very pleasurable indeed. Max already mentioned it, the scope of the book is quite intense and wide, but the sheer scope, which is a scope that would surely drive lesser scholars to distraction, foregrounds a very crucial point as far as I'm concerned about the role of prisons in society. So if you please bear with me as I go through the points that excite me most, and then move to two questions. So in the book, I think Professor Fludernik really shows quite exactly how pervasive metaphors of confinement really are. They are in the news, of course. Think of Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, more recently re-education camps in Xinjiang, or prison riots that happened at the beginning of the lockdown. But they are also seated in our fantasies, pervading, and I quote Professor Fludernik here, social and societal arenas that have no immediate connection with crime, punishment, the police, or the law, end quote. This is from the preface. So why is this such an important finding? For me, the answer, one of the answers to a question like this lies in the book's persistent tracking of the slippages between fact, fiction, and fantasy. Tracing the feedback loops between the three categories, showing that the prison and confinement circulate socially beyond the facts of penal policy or political decision-making, but are in fact cultural categories that live in people's minds and hearts and bodies, and actively inform decisions in these different arenas that lie also outside the individual clearly. And in order to make this point clear, I think Metaphors of Confinement does a really good job in shifting attention away a little bit from the question whether metaphors discussed are right or wrong, but to how they work in context, what knowledges they produce, what ideologies they produce or reproduce, and how these often historically accumulated metaphors can be understood in a contemporary setting. Metaphors, and this is my favorite quote from the book, are ideological foot soldiers. You can find this on page 42. And these foot soldiers perform cultural work, as Professor Fludernik also mentioned just now, by acting on readers' feelings and manipulating their subconscious attitudes and beliefs, which is on page 53. A cultural work that consists, as metaphors do, sort of as a simultaneous feeling and unfeeling of the real life import of the politics and ethics of penal confinement, also a quote from the preface. An important example, Professor Fludernik already mentioned it just now, is the shift from the old to the new prison and the way in which metaphors don't really, or not always, take account or register that shift. Old imagery stays behind in the cultural imaginary, which is then perhaps an obvious question would be, does the cultural imaginary lag behind reality? But I think Professor Fludernik shows that that's not perhaps the further question to ask, and instead, I think she looks very closely and compellingly at the tensions between these spectacularized images of the nastiness of prison and how that rubs up against the realities of penal policies worldwide, right? So what I'm trying to say is that these metaphors do the work of on the one hand, showing up the nastiness, but also hiding specific realities. For instance, harrowing consistencies between penal settings, but also immigration detention, for instance, right? So by spectacularizing that nastiness in an old-fashioned way, it's almost as if the prison is placed outside of modernity. And that is a potentially very harmful move. But on the other end of the spectrum, and I think Professor Fludernik is more careful with conclusions of this nature than I am, and I think she's perhaps a bit more right, but I also like the hopeful side of things, is that metaphors can also produce very productive cultural critique. And I think particularly of Behrouz Bouchani's recent book, No Friend But the Mountains, where he uses prison metaphors to make visible the nature of his internment in the Australian immigration detention system. But I do think that thanks to Professor Fludernik, we are now much more capable of tracing and deconstructing how such imaginaries come into being, and of drawing attention to the consequences of these metaphors, of the complicities that are involved in them, also as audiences, as scholars, but also sometimes as I think the productive potential of this collective carceral imaginary. Very telling examples, one like also to say like how well this book is already landing is my students find it extremely rewarding to work with it, and they are, several of them are currently putting it on all sorts of different settings. A very notable example was a master student last summer who wrote about the Black rappers and activists, Tupac Shakur, Notorious B.I.G., Kendrick Lamar, J. Cole, and how for these artists, prison is both reality and a metaphor, and how they use these metaphors to educate new generations on the ins and outs of the structural violence that is involved in ghetto life, for instance. My questions are about this structural violence, particularly about domesticity and coloniality as they are described in the book. So from your mapping, Professor Fludernik, of the carceral imaginary across these chapters, you mentioned the happy prison, but there's, I think, another central paradox that you mentioned several times around the prison and the concept of the home or homeliness, and how prisons come to stand for a disruption of a domestic idyll or an idyllic family space, particularly, although not exclusively, for women. In the conclusion, you write, for instance, that prison may be a foreign country in which they do things differently, but it is a country that, troublingly, shares many features with our familiar world and casts a dark shadow of all our lives. So page 633. So my question is, thinking about the lockdown, Max also mentioned that he was reading it during lockdown. I also read your book during lockdown. And I kept wondering whether you have encountered more about this connection between carceral metaphoricity and disrupted domesticity during the pandemic. My second question, do I still have time, Max? Okay, great, thanks.
Yes.
My second question is about my favorite chapter in the book, which is chapter 6. It had to vie for favoritism with chapter 7, but I will stick for now to chapter 6, where you focus on what happens when society itself is regarded as a prison-like structure in a metaphorical sense. So first you talk there about authors from the end of the 19th and 20th century from the UK and the US who were very anti-prison. And you set up a very, to me, like a very compelling and strong reading of punitive desires in the US context specifically. And how that is sort of drives many contemporary societies' preoccupations with punishment. And there too you flag the importance of the imaginary. This is on page 372. Punitivity, you say, is a form of imaginary violence directed against persons perceived to be morally or racially inferior, who then become the projection screen for repressed drives under the guise of moral duty and benevolent patronizing. Then, after this quote, you shift quite abruptly but not unpleasantly, to India and South Africa to talk about the affinities between prisons and colonialism as a structure. And you talk about the metaphorical prison that the colony is for both colonized and colonizer, but you also discuss the material function there of the prison in the wider carceral system of colonialism. And then finally, in that chapter, you turn to what you call the neo-colonial prison archipelago, and particularly focused there on political imprisonment in Malawi. This was very long, apologies, but I felt it was important to summarize the chapter, or the way I have read it, for my question to come across. I was hoping you could say more about the connections between these three settings in the chapter, as they move through time and also as they change geographical settings, clearly, how you see the role of punitivity in these different settings. You say there are affinities, and I see them in the chapter, but can you also maybe pinpoint some of the differences and whether you think punitive desires have changed in your view, or whether we seem to be stuck to some extent in mostly repetitive patterns of punitivity? Thank you very much for your attention. These were my comments and questions, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. This is very, very interesting. Am I responding now or waiting for the second comment?
I would suggest having the second comment and then responding to both. If that's okay with you. Great. So Lindsay, can I invite you to give your comment?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks to you, Max, for bringing us together and for the opportunity to read the book and to think about it. And I don't want to spend, I mean, it goes without saying, it's extraordinary, it's rich, there's an incredible kind of range and depth of research in the book, and every chapter is offering some nuance, some introduction to unfamiliar writings or new perspectives on familiar writings. So there's an awful lot there, and I really am in awe of Monika for the massive amount of research and the understanding that she brings to this. So there's an awful lot that can be said, and I think that I'm going to make two comments about the book, and obviously I should preface this by saying, as Max mentioned in the introduction, I mean, I'm not a scholar of literature. I'm a criminal lawyer, a historian of criminal law, and that perhaps is reflected in the things that I'm interested in or picked up on in the book, and in a certain way also to say that what I'm interested in it might be more generally described as the kind of the political message of the book. And one of the things that is picked up in the introduction and throughout is the work that metaphors might do in challenging practices of imprisonment, in challenging the carceral imaginary, and that's really what I want to focus on in my two comments here. And this is to focus on a very small part of the book, and I risk run the risk here of not doing justice to the whole range of the argument. So my first comment then, and this is about the carceral imaginary. So a central kind of theme of the book is the exploration of the carceral imaginary, and this is set out on pages 52 to 59 of the book. And this is explicitly described or conceived of in quite broad terms. There's different points at which Monika's saying it's distinct from the ubiquity of prison imagery, so it's something wider. And I think, if I've understood the argument rightly, the carceral is conceived very broadly as any kind of confinement or restriction. So it includes here the examples, not only imprisonment, confinement, but also being fettered, being chained, being caged, being buried alive, and so on. And this, is particularly then strong in the sections of the book which are dealing with the way that this carceral imaginary is used to explain or make sense of everyday life. So particularly the chapters on marriage, for example, as a form of confinement or imprisonment. And these chapters I found extraordinarily interesting because showing the fluidity, the way the metaphors move and are used to explain different types of experience is extremely interesting. So it brings out the distinction between prisoner's world on the one hand, on the other hand, world as prison, and also tells us something about the continuity, as you put it, of the representational practice. However, my concern or my question is about the extent to which this is carceral, or what puts the carceral in carceral imaginary. And here I would like to make the case for a more limited understanding of the carceral as a particular kind of confinement in a prison, and possibly even a particular kind of modern prison, where the loss of liberty and the hard treatment are seen as the reasons, the raison d'etre of the confinement. So that, when I understand the carceral, and no doubt this is inflected by my own reading of Foucault, who has already loomed large today, and obviously we can't escape in this kind of area. The carceral is something rather specific relating to the modern prison. So, and why am I arguing this? Well, it's partly because many of the forms of restriction or confinement don't seem particularly carceral to me. When we talk about being confined, and I know lockdown has already mentioned, and people did talk during lockdown as the experience of confinement. It was confinement, but it wasn't carceral confinement. And I think there's a difference between confinement and carceral confinement, or confinement specifically in a prison or a modern prison. These other forms of confinement are not necessarily imposed for punitive reasons or by the state. And my concern here is that if we conceive of the carceral imaginary so broadly, it's not clear to me that we can then shed light on particular practices of punishing or imprisoning, such as the modern carceral logics, which are described in chapters 6 and 7. So just going on from this, I mean, I think the continuity is understood or is framed in a certain way by focusing on a certain kind of experience or on a certain certain physical elements of the prison or the dungeon, and this is what gives the continuity. If you focus on the walls, if you focus on the bars of the cell or the bars on the window, then one cell is very much like another cell, and we can see there's continuity. But what we lose there is the sense, what is the institution the cell is located within, here, it seems to me, there are very important differences between different types of carcerality, different types of prison, and it's important to reflect on those differences as well as seeing the continuity. So we see continuity then in terms of the experience of confinement, but without seeing how different types of confinement or confinement in different types of institutions might be different. So the broader way of framing the question then is to ask whether imprisonment is understood as a specific form of the carceral, or is it something distinct? And that then brings me on to my second comment, which is perhaps focused on what's already been described in Hanneke's comment as how metaphors work. And here I wanted to ask about the uses of metaphor, and more specifically to wonder, and this is perhaps counterintuitively, whether metaphors might be a barrier to understanding practices of imprisonment. So rather than metaphors being a way of opening up our understanding, of translating, if you like, that understanding and making it a common understanding, it actually closes down that experience. So, and this is perhaps being a bit provocative, Monika, but it's perhaps asking about the poverty of metaphors. The metaphors rather limit what we can understand rather than opening out. So what do I mean by this? And the thought was prompted in part by reading chapter 6 of the book, which discusses the modern prison and the arguments of different penal reformers from Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, Menninger, Wilson, Mead, and so on. And here, I think, in interesting ways, Monika shows how the arguments of the reformers were dominated by certain metaphors, in particular, the metaphor of prison as hell, or as prison as a form of burial or burial alive. And this, in turn, seems to be shaped by a particular kind of monastic or penitentiary logic that we can, in talking about prison as hell, there's clear overtones of the kind of Christian tradition and the way that's informed certain understandings of prison or imprisonment. What was interesting about the chapter, though, is that in each of the writings from Wilde to Wilson, the reformers were also describing certain kinds of penal practices, and so they were juxtaposing the claim prison as hell with rather detailed descriptions of particular practices that went on in prison, whether they had experienced these personally, as in the case of Oscar Wilde, or whether, as George Bernard Shaw, they were external observers. And what this juxtaposition made me wonder was if the overarching metaphor of hell, of burial alive, actually obscured the particular carceral practices or flattened the differences between particular types of prison or imprisonment. That's to say that imprisonment, in this, and I go back to my first comment, that the modern prison is not about something ineffable. It's not about something reaching out to the transcendent, as in the kind of Christian tradition. It's about very mundane things. The loss of liberty is experienced not as hell, but as just a continual drip, drip, drip of little interferences with liberty and impositions. And it's these mundane things that are really important. The reforms. So the point is, do the metaphors help us to understand those mundane practices, or do the metaphors distract us from the mundane practices? And how are we to understand the relationship between the two? So, in other words, say, is the use of the metaphor or the work that's being done by the metaphor, whether it's referring to the world in prison or the prison in the world, does it end up not telling us very much either about the prison or the world? So when we, to go back to the kind of mundane example of lockdown, we can say, well, it was like being in prison. But that the problem with that kind of claim and the use of the metaphor of imprisonment there is actually, it wasn't being like being in prison, but nor was nor equally the other way around. It perhaps imprisonment doesn't help us to understand very much about what was going on with lockdown either. So yeah, the question I'm asking then is what is the work that metaphors do, and how does it sit with our understanding of the kind of mundane realities? So I hope that's brief, but I hope it's clear. And once again, thank you, Monika, for the book.
Thank you. These are wonderful questions, and they're very difficult to say something really profound about them. So since you also mentioned the lockdown, and that was Hanneke Stewart's first question, yes, I think that, of course, if you look at the actual prison experience, the lockdown was not very close to it, but it was still, for many people, an experience of being hindered from doing things by an outside authority, which, well, was the state or the health organizations. And I think that therefore, because they were unused to being restricted in their movements, in what they wanted to do, for them, it was very close to an experience of imprisonment, even though it wasn't institutional imprisonment. And I think that what really, and you're quite right about that, people do know very little about what goes on in actual prisons. And so I think that people's ideas, and of course, law scholars know much more about this, but I think the general public really knows about prisons from literature and films these days, and their insights or their images of what they think is happening there are very unrealistic. I mean, this is true of practically everything that happens in films. My friend who's a pathologist says he can't look at pathology series because he's just so put out by all the stuff which is not right in there, which of course I don't notice because I only have those films to relate to. But I think that because people do not know, and because their images are really related, or these metaphors also related to personal feelings of frustration in the largest sense, I think they really linked this, and the fact of not being able to go out made one feel imprisoned. Now, it doesn't really say anything about actual imprisonment. So I'm quite with you there. And I think that you're putting your finger on the problem that these metaphors really do not relate to reality very well. Or there are, in fact, there are some metaphors in prison films, and I'm sort of anticipating what Anne was asking about in the text I already read, that for instance, the fact that you have the prison yard is something that, except for some very modern 20th century prison novels, doesn't really feature in the metaphors that I've looked at. But that is something that is, of course, very constitutive of prison films. And you also have the gang rape, which occurs there again and again. But then if you think of actual prison conditions, I think that, as you say, the drip, the very small things, the fact of not being allowed to decide on this, that, and the other, the fact of having to wait for ages to be able to phone your wife or your husband and so on, just that makes a lot more difference to actual prisoners in current carceral scenarios, as well as the sort of disciplining that is still going on in sort of changed form. So I can see that as a lawyer, you would actually want to preserve the differences between various institutions. And I grant you that, because I've looked through several centuries, and basically it's colonial prisons which actually are sort of a merger between very old kinds of prisons and new prisons. So sort of they have the negative aspects of both the old and the new system, according to Foucault. But the specific institutions, I wasn't really going into that. And I don't think that the metaphors do. I think that that is actually the fact that metaphors do partially seem to occlude what is actually going on, which is what Hannika Stewart also said. So, but coming back to from Hannika Stewart's question about the lockdown, which was her first question, I think that one can't really say anything in general about it, because you know, I've talked to such a lot of people and they have such different experiences. And in fact, positive and negative ones. So actually, a lot of people were enjoying the lockdown because they could finally clean up their attic and listen to all their nice music on their DVDs and CDs. And others were absolutely frustrated. And it was also very much socially dependent. So obviously, if you're stuck in a 40 square meter flat with a husband and 3 children in Paris, this was a much more threatening situation than living in a big house with a garden. And the other thing was that also some people had some people were battling with violence and aggression because of these scenarios, whereas others were really sort of rediscovering home life and baking and redecorating and playing games and whatnot. So I think the situation actually was very ambivalent, and even among my colleagues, those with small children really had an extremely hard time, whereas those who were single and now blissfully didn't need to commute were having the time of their lives. So it's a very difficult to sort of look at it from one perspective, but I do feel that the people who experienced it negatively had a sort of general notion of being confined to what, and this is clearly different from an actual prison, that's quite clear. But of course, metaphor is precisely the method of pointing out similarities where actually, obviously, there are great differences. So the whole point of a metaphor is to take an area of life which doesn't seem to be the same thing, but then to project from that perspective onto the situation. And so from that perspective, I think that people did actually experience, at least according to their lights, or some people did experience this as confining and carceral in the sense of confining in these metaphors. Actually, the term carceral in the way I use it is not necessary, as I correctly said, related to prisons, and I actually then use actual imprisonment as the location in an actual prison. Hanneke also mentioned chapter 6 and the colonial prison and the link to punitivity. And I think that's very interesting, because I think that in a colonial or neo-colonial scenario, prison is punitive, but not because you, as in the examples from Oscar Wilde and the 19th century George Bernard Shaw, because of people's psychological need to punish people, but it's a political matter. It's because particular people are perceived as threatening, also, well, othered, basically, politically different, whatever, and that's why they're put into prison. So a lot of this post-colonial and of course colonial situation is one which is very much ideologically, politically motivated. Where I find this punitivity extremely present nowadays, and I really am quite emotionally threatened by that, is the way in which refugees are being treated, and deliberately treated in very punitive, and I would really call this punitive manner, in order to have a sort of a general deterrence against their coming to the West. And we are all, unfortunately, our governments are doing all of these things and are sort of blanch with shame every time it comes up on the news when you hear what's happening in Moria in Greece, or the recent article I read about people off the boat who were left with their wet clothes for hours sitting on the shore as a sort of sign we don't want to. And I feel that is just really, really bad, and it's a real sign of this punitive spirit in, and again, as it used to be in these 19th century proposals, in order to deter people from, in this case, coming to the West. So I think there is a link, and actually the link is closer with the treatment of refugees almost, because it's not only politically, there's also a lot of psychological, obviously xenophobic feeling that is connected with it. So I think, yeah, so what maybe I should also add to what Lindsay said about the issues that get occluded. So I think one of the issues that get occluded is crowding, which doesn't really play a role in the metaphors and even in the texts, only infrequently in some of the post-colonial texts. Another issue that also gets completely occluded is anxiety about family members, particularly on the part of women about their children, which is so strong in autobiographical texts and also literature by criminologists on the prison, where this really, really is sort of almost the center of prisoners' experience. And that really does not show up in metaphors. I think I'll stop here. Thank you. I hope I haven't run on.
No, that was perfect. Thanks so much, Monika. In the program, we have a 5-minute break, and can I suggest we stick to that and have a short break, just to allow everyone as well to, or if you would like to ask a question. There's already, to write your question in the chat, there's already 3 or 4 excellent questions, so do take the opportunity to write something. Shall we come back together at 5, so in 5 minutes? Okay, I think we might start back. Anne, can I invite you to share with us your comment?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Max. And I'd also like to begin by thanking Max again for the invitation and for organizing this event. And also, I'd like to express my admiration for Monika's really magnificent achievement of a book. It's really a product of erudite scholarship, and it's a display of truly encyclopedic knowledge, I think. And yet I also found it highly readable. I'd like to use my time today by focusing on the concept of the carceral imaginary and the relationship between the literary and the visual, as well as the question of ethics raised in the book, and some brief reflections on methodology. Max already mentioned in the introduction that I'm coming to this as a literary and cultural studies scholar, and also as someone who's worked with prisons, which is probably why I'm particularly interested in some of the ethical questions the book is concerned with too. So to begin with a brief reflection on methodology, and we come back to Foucault, who's been looming large, as Lindsay already said earlier. The study avoids a teleological narrative, and despite drawing some inspiration from Michel Foucault's theories, the book emphasizes continuities between periods rather than working with the notion of a key historical rupture that brings about a radical change in the role of the prison and its representation. In Foucault's Discipline and Punish, That rupture is, of course, the shift from the ancien regime to the socio-political organization of a bourgeois capitalist society. Monika's analysis of textual depictions of imprisonment from the early modern period to the late 20th century takes a transhistorical approach, which is truly impressive, while arguably also perhaps posing some challenges. While the textual readings always remain very aware of context to some extent, there is inevitably a risk that we might lose some of the detail that a period-specific or national geographic organization might have afforded. So I'm really interested in hearing more about the ways in which Monika negotiated this methodological challenge of a transhistorical and transnational approach. And similarly, I was also curious about what I thought was a slight slippage in how the study positions itself in relation to Foucault. Chapter 10 notes that, quote, although not all prison metaphors relate to the dungeon as the prototypical prison frame, the prevalence of its invocation, especially in post-1789 literature, marks the significance of such anachronism in the literary imagery of carcerality. This is on page 592. Does this reference to 1789 as a turning point covertly evoke a Foucauldian rupture after all? And again, Monika might like to briefly comment further on the ways in which her findings challenge Foucault's argument about a substantial shift in how punishment and imprisonment were conceived. Monika defines the carceral imaginary as the overall vision of what imprisonment means in our culture, page 52. And she highlights the ubiquity of prison imagery in literary, journalistic, and political discourse, as well as everyday conversations. The carceral imaginary is, she notes, a site of ideology. And her particular attention lies in metaphors, of course, and their role in establishing and maintaining ideology. Metaphors, she compellingly suggests, perform cultural work, either in support of or to criticize penal trends. And her study focuses on the combination of three things. One, metaphors. Two, tropes that have become topoi through recurrent use. And three, thematic topoi in prison-related literature. The carceral imaginary, as she defines it, is formed by the conjunction of these three elements. And I'd like to bring Monika's findings in conversation here with some other recent work on the carceral imaginary that focuses on visual rather than literary imaginaries. Monika's Metaphors of Confinement gestures towards an interdisciplinary framework in lots of ways, drawing on theoretical, methodological elements from a range of academic disciplines. And I would suggest that our understanding of the carceral imaginary can be further enhanced by applying some of the book's insights to cultural texts beyond the literary. The book, in fact, briefly references prison movies and visual arts, but they're not, of course, its focus. There's only so much one book can do, and this book already does an awful lot. So, for example, we might fruitfully consider Monika's discussion of Gothic tropes and anti-Catholic propaganda depicting abbesses as cruel prison matrons, as she writes on page 256, with the sadistic prison matrons who are a recurring feature of the Women in Prison film. That is just one example. Extending the book's insights on carceral metaphors towards the visual also strikes me as especially important given the prison's ambivalent status in relation to visibility. As Nicole Fleetwood writes in her recent book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, published in 2020, visual images of imprisonment proliferate in popular culture, which very much echoes Monika's argument about the ubiquity of prison imagery. These images, Fleetwood suggests, quote, offer a familiarity with prison as a cornerstone institution of modern life, end of quote. Paradoxically, prisons and those who reside in them remain largely invisible, though. prison is an institution that the non-incarcerated can typically only access through what Fleetwood calls a set of rehearsed images created by the state and by non-incarcerated image makers. Drawing on prison abolitionist Angela Davis, Fleetwood notes that this that the familiarity produced through these kinds of rehearsed images actually normalizes prisons, and that the state's power, quote, to make visible and invisible underscores the significance of visuality as a tool of state authority that structures who sees and who can be seen, end of quote. Reading this, I was really struck by the similarity between Monika's analysis of the role of literary tropes and topoi in constructing a carceral imaginary and Fleetwood's insistence on the power of a set of rehearsed visual images that shape how most people engage with the closed world of the prison. Fleetwood in her study foregrounds incarcerated artists' practices as a form of carceral aesthetics, often a kind of resistant carceral aesthetics, which also have ethical implications because they try to, as she puts it, forge community with other incarcerated people and communicate with non-incarcerated allies and the public. And this again, I think, resonates with Monika's point with what Monika calls the ethical imperative in the cultural role of literary depictions of imprisonment. And here I was very interested in Monika's distinction between external and internal views. In other words, between those that look into the prison from the outside, seeing it as an other, versus those depictions looking from the inside out. According to Monika, these two perspectives, quote, perform quite different kinds of cultural work. Page 642, with the internal view more likely to be framed by and to generate sympathy. What strikes me as key then is to imagine and promote literary creative practices that facilitate alliances between these two perspectives. So we might ask what kinds of creative co-production with non-incarcerated people whose position is often marked by substantial privilege could give the incarcerated more equal access to and control of the means of representation to help shape new forms of carceral imaginaries, if we can't quite get rid of the carceral imaginary for the time being. Returning to the question of the visual, I'm also keen to hear a little bit more from Monika on how she sees the difference between literary and visual depictions and how they construct carceral imaginaries. The study's conclusion seems to insinuate that literary texts more readily and, quote, comprehensively manage to convey the trauma of incarceration and pose the ethical questions of the limits of legal justice. The book here suggests that literary texts offer a kind of vicarious experience to the reader by means of carceral metaphor, whereas prison films, to a large extent, here seem to be associated with sensationalism. So is there a categorical difference then in the kind of cultural work that different types of textual forms, visual or literary, can achieve? And what might this mean for a culture that increasingly is dominated by visuality? And I thought I would end by posing quite a big question to Monika, but maybe this is really a question for all of us about pedagogy. I think we spoke already about, I think Hanneke already talked about pedagogy and student work that's happening, which is great to hear. So I'm wondering how we want to consider how we engage students in thinking critically about carceral literature and representations on screen. How do we avoid reinforcing carceral imaginaries through our own practices as scholars and teachers? Is there such a thing as a post-carceral literary and cultural studies, and what might that look like? Thank you very much for listening, and thank you in advance to Monika for responding.
Thanks so much, Anne. Alan.
Thank you, Max. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me to the symposium on Monika's wonderful book. And of course, I'd like to thank Monika herself for producing it. At over 650 pages, it truly is a tour de force. There's so much to take from it. And I think so many different people could take so many different things from it. So I'm not a law and literature scholar, though I admire the work of those in this particular field. And I think there is common ground, common cause between the kind of work that Monika is doing and the kind of work that I'm doing. But I would describe myself as a critical realist and a critical legal theorist with particular interests in criminal justice. And it's from that perspective that I will try to engage with the book. And I'd stress that this is a rather preliminary statement of a position. And I apologize if it addresses things that concern me, perhaps, as much as things that concern Monika. But I wonder and I hope that there might be things that we have in common. So, as a non-specialist, my standard dictionary definition of a metaphor is a term that one uses to link two things that are not the same, but which are said to have a resemblance. This involves the use of imagination to make a connection, and the connection is then illuminating, perhaps revealing an aspect of the object one had not previously identified. This is not a question, as Monika says, of literary ornamentation, but of a way of thinking of what she calls thinking of metaphor as involving a recategorization process. This seems right to me. It has been said, for example, that metaphor is important in the building of new scientific theories, where one might not expect to find them, as a means of reaching beyond normal science, normal scientific assumptions. But that's just one example, and what metaphors the book conveys above all else is the flexibility and diversity of uses to which a concept can be put. The idea of the prison founds a huge number of what Monika calls target and source usages. Target means prison is something. Source means something is a prison. And these go to make up a carceral imaginary. The titles and contents of the 10 chapters roam widely over law and literature, coupling prison metaphors with the home, with love, with gender, with poetry, and of course with those things which criminal justice scholars normally view as the prison in penal theory, retribution, imprisonment, and punishment. For many, perhaps most criminal justice theorists, this breadth of approach may be a problem, although I think it ought not to be. To the analytical legal mind, argument ought not to deviate from a rather preconceived normative framework associated with a small range of accredited theorists. So Kant and Rawls will always get high marks. Hegel in a particular reading, not quite so much, but he'll still be okay. If criminal justice investigation delves into history or moral psychology or literature, the question will be asked sooner or later, but what has this got to do with law? What you're saying is really very interesting, and I'm enjoying reading it, but it represents further reading on my syllabus. This is the lawyer speaking. And if you will forgive me, I must now return to that. And that's what I would describe as the marginalization gambit, which I think a lot of critical theorists critical legal theorists will understand. A specific variant, perhaps pertaining to metaphors, might be to ask, are there not at least two books here which could and should be treated separately, one on law, the other on literature? Now, I think metaphors invites and deserves an answer to this comment, and indeed should be defended from it. And one question to Monika would be just if she recognizes the complaint and what her answer to it would be if she does. I think it would be a fairly, generic, something one would recognize, certainly within legal studies, as being a fairly generic kind of standpoint. My response would be something like this. First, I think it's important to give criminal justice studies the kind of broader perspective a law and literature thematic achieves. Taking the idea of metaphor and seeking out the connections that it can identify helps us to see more widely what might be at stake in thinking about punishment in its various modern guises. Metaphor trades off the creativity and freedom of the human mind to make connections and find innovative ways forward. The connections it achieves are generally there for a reason, and we should attend to them for what they tell us beyond the given. But that may not be enough. The standard theorist is happy, after all, to have their attention drawn to what lies beyond the given field, at least for purposes of diversion and interest. Could one say more about the value of this broader approach? Well, criminal justice is a generally bleak field, and I found myself warming considerably to those parts of metaphors where the book discusses, for example, the idea of poetic confinement. Here, as I understand it, the basic idea in Wordsworth or Keats is that the sonnet is itself a kind of shackle, but one that can bring solace and liberation as the form in which aesthetic experience is given expression. Okay, but what has that got to do with the modern prison? This is, in a way, perhaps Lindsay's question. Here, the spectre of two books hoves into view. When writers write of what the prison is like, as opposed to what is like the prison, are these not two different ball games? My response then to this would be a third point: to conceive of the prison in aesthetics and the prison as modern carceral reality, to conceive of these as two sides of the same modern post-Enlightenment coin. Very roughly, I say this, the same modernity which gave rise to the industrial penal complex also gave rise to the promise and the hopes of enlightenment and romantic aesthetic experience. Though he ended up defending capital punishment, Wordsworth also extolled the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Things, of course, the whole earth, the beauty wore of promise, he wrote. Well, things didn't quite turn out that way. Yet the residues of emancipation echo through the literary canon, foregrounding what Monika describes as symbolic and philosophical resonances of the worlds they portray, and offering a different ethical diet to that of consignment inside or indeed outside the prison. Poems, novels, and plays, she says, quote, comprehensively manage to convey the trauma of incarceration and to pose the ethical question of the limits of legal justice. Now, this kind of doubling, this opposition between the literary and the penal in the modern sense seems to me to be important. It seems to give an important alternative position to thinking about the prison, the modern prison, not just in terms of a compassion that supplements a knowledge of punishment, but also from a place from which to begin rethinking how modern societies do social control. It's not just that literature brings out human spirit that the prison suppresses, but that it produces ideas of what is important in human life and how people might deal differently with what prisons deal with badly. Now, here I would suggest that there is something at the heart of modern penality which needs to be addressed. Behind the persecutory and punitive forms it takes, there is a moral issue, I think, which is that some human beings do things which are truly horrible and which violate others. This leaves victims to deal with terrible, painful experiences, and ultimately leaves some or many perpetrators to deal from the point of view of being a perpetrator with them too. I wouldn't equate the suffering of the one with the other, yet an act of violation which leaves a victim to mourn and a perpetrator to feel guilt means that we are left with nothing but grief on all sides. The grieving of victims for what has become of them and of perpetrators for what they have done are things that the criminal justice system does not deal with, as Monika makes very clear in the book. Perhaps after 200 years of repetitive punitive failure, it's time to rethink how society addresses violation in terms of an underlying moral psychology of violation, of mourning, of guilt and atonement. Can literature not help here? There is much talk in criminal justice circles at the present of penal abolitionism, but there is a need to be clear about what kinds of moral terms would inform an abolitionist approach. Where better then to look for alternative models of justice than in the poem and the novel? That may look a utopian proposal, especially under the weight and assumptions of the present, but I am happy to opt for the utopian over the dystopian. It is also a form of real or concrete utopianism in the sense that human beings are capable of acting morally in much better ways than they sometimes do. And of course, literature conveys that. I'll finish with one reference to a time when the prison itself became a place of art and poetry. I refer to the experience of the Barlinnie Special Unit in Glasgow, which in the late 60s and early 70s developed a therapeutic unit dealing with Scotland's most violent and ungovernable prisoners, and most persecuted and punished prisoners. It produced a culture, the special unit produced a culture of freedom, democracy, and self-expression, albeit, and perhaps paradoxically, inside a high security jail. I'm not going down the line of the happy prison here, but I think there was something different happened in that time in that prison, which is worth looking at. It produced sculptors, poets, and writers who were successful in being these things and who in the process ceased to be violent. The unit's fate was to be marginalized and eventually closed for some of the reasons Monika charts in metaphors relating to the need for a deterrent environment within a society where the prison could not look like a better option than daily life for working class people. But it was before it was closed, it had given the lie to the carceral complex's claim that there is no alternative. The sculptor and one-time inmate Jimmy Boyle's A Sense of Freedom might be a literary text to add to Monika's comprehensive and stimulating work. One more to add to a huge and fascinating diet with which she has provided us.
Thank you so much, both of you, for your comments and also the thoughts that moved on from the reading of the book, which are entirely insightful. Let me start with Anne, if I may. And so I think you've asked about the methodological challenges of the book and particularly its transhistorical aspect. And well, this obviously was very difficult, but what I've tried to do is to pick a representative text from various periods and then to delve as much as I could into the background. To what extent that has always worked, I won't say, because I'm not actually a specialist in each of these historical periods, but I've tried to do my best to read up on the background. But what was very interesting about this is that certain historical backgrounds did become extremely important. And you mentioned the French Revolution, and the French Revolution really was a major point at which things changed, as we already discussed, from the Ancien Regime to a more democratic system, at least initially. And it's very interesting because you also asked about the dungeon and whether there really is a continuity or whether there are periods when the dungeon becomes more important. And the reason, of course, it becomes important around the French Revolution is because of the discourse about the Ancien Regime and the imprisonment in the Bastille and so on. And the interesting thing about that is that a lot of that is quite fictional, because at the point of the destruction of the Bastille, there were very few actual prisoners in the Bastille. And so a lot of this very prototypical discourse about the dungeon of the Bastille was correct, but not for the actual point in time when the Bastille was destroyed. So again, here we actually see how fiction and fact were merged and in fact developed into a whole fantasy of this Ancien Regime prison. But of course, the dungeon was there before, and it continued into some Victorian texts, but wasn't as much around as during or in the immediate vicinity of the French Revolution. And as I already said, in current discussions of supermax prisons, it's very much come back again for describing people's experience there. So the other thing that I do want to mention is that there are, of course, literary texts which do describe actual prison conditions relatively realistically, but usually not in terms of metaphors, but in terms of scenarios. So if you look at Victorian prisons, Dickens is a bad example for realism in representation of prisons. It's either extremely a persiflage of prison, or it's very ancient. It's also prisons that are prisons of the 18th century that he's dealing with, basically. But if you look at Felix Holt by George Eliot, you actually see that Felix goes to prison. And although we don't really hear a lot about it, but what it does say about the prison is fairly realistic. So that we do have texts that deal with prison experience in a fairly realistic manner. And of course, in the 20th century, get more such texts as well, also detective stories that include that. Your other question was about visuality, and that is, of course, a major issue. And I didn't want to deal with that because I knew there were quite a lot of studies already on the prison film. And I'm not really a film person in terms of research. And I haven't, I think, watched that many films, and not particularly series. I'm very averse to consuming many hours in watching series. But I did think about that a lot. And I think that there are actually different types of films. So I think what I know best are sort of films of 1.5 or 2 hours that have are about prisons. And I think these are very different from some of these series where you have a lot more time. So they're much more novelistic, but they're also much more realistic and less sensational. So the sensationalism, I think, really attaches to these sort of key classic films about prison, where you have this gang rape and you have The Yard and so on. But some of these more sort of series seem to be looking at some of the experiences that I mentioned earlier, like trying to contact your relatives or your children, having a problem with, am I going to lose the flat in which I used, and how am I going to pay for it? Or who can organize this, that, or for me? How do I get to the telephone? How do I smuggle a phone into prison, and so on? So, so these issues, which are very true to the prison experience, emerge much more forcefully in these texts. And I once was in a discussion about a German series, which is currently being rebroadcast on German television. And I haven't seen all of the films in the series, just a few of the episodes. But in the discussion, the person here is the chair of the discussion was a director of a German prison, and he said, "Oh, this is also unrealistic, and this doesn't really. What is the public going to take away from such a film?" And then I said, "Well, but you know, one of the good things about this series is that you actually imagine the people who are depicted as prisoners as just people like you and me." And then he said, "That's very interesting, because that's a positive thing, and I didn't think of it in that way." And I think that that actually happened because one of the, and I think that doesn't happen with this 1.5 to 2 hour film, which doesn't really have time, I think, to present people in this manner, but you get a sort of lots and lots of different prisoners in these series, and then their background stories, and you understand, well, you know, everybody could slip up and end up in prison, and you get people's particular characteristics and so on. So they're more like real people, and they're not sort of rejected by society from the perspective of the viewer. So the viewer actually takes them as people like you and me, even though the setting is the prison. And so this is, I think, something that would be very interesting to look into in more detail, but these are just sort of initial thoughts on my part. And finally, you said something about pedagogy, and I think that literature actually, of course, does a lot of good in terms of teaching people about prison, particularly if it's autobiographies, but also literary texts in trying to think about the situation of imprisonment, which, you know, most people don't even want to think about, although the metaphors are with them all the time. I think there was a period in British penal policy where things really moved forward and improved tremendously. And this was after all these suffragettes and First World War draft dodgers who ended up in prison started to write about their prison experiences. And then, of course, you also had Churchill, and you really got reforms in British prisons, which first of all reduced the number of prisoners, but also made prison conditions improved them tremendously. And then, you know, it was lost again, basically by the 60s, I think. So actually, writing about prisons can have a very positive effect, but I think that the general situation has to be right, and you have to have people with whom the public is able to sympathize, because they're sort of one of us. So if that had been a murderer writing this, there wouldn't have been any effect, because people would immediately have felt very antagonistic towards this person, so they wouldn't have wanted to listen. But if this was somebody from the middle or upper classes who ended up because he didn't want to kill people in World War I, this was somebody people could very easily sympathize with, and they would listen. So I think that there is a chance for improvement, but it's always very dependent on the circumstances, who speaks, whether there's a general background where people are willing to listen. And unfortunately, at the moment, I don't really see that kind of thing as happening. But, let me rush on to Alan and your very interesting comments. And so I think, and this also I think is maybe an answer also to Lindsay, is that generally I also think that reading literature in general is something that broadens your mind and that helps you to appreciate people, but also their problems, to feel more sympathetic towards a variety of different situations. And it doesn't have to be only imprisonment, it can be all sorts of things like sexual harassment or whatever. So I think that is just something that literature is very good at doing. The question is whether it actually makes people behave differently or initiate reforms, which hasn't been such a good success story, I think, historically speaking. I think that this law and literature movement in the United States started with people in law schools saying we need to train our future judges and lawyers to have an understanding of what they're doing to people when they are putting them into prison. And I mean, one very practical solution would actually be to require every law student to spend a week in prison. But of course, nobody would want to do it under the kind of conditions which imprisonment are currently have. So it's a proposal that's not going to be taken up. I think you also mentioned abolitionism, so I'll just say something about it. And it's a really, really big problem. And I think one of the problems is that people always want to have one solution for everything. And that's just not possible. So I don't think there is solution X replace prison by Y. But I think you have to have a lot of different strategies and be very careful about what kinds of people, what kinds of backgrounds, what kinds of situations there are. Because I mean, there are people who slip into crime or are tempted once in their lifetime, and they're the ones who get caught because the sort of professional thieves are much too smart, at least in a lot of the time. So, but then there are also people who commit larceny and they transfer millions or billions somewhere offshore, and obviously they have a lot of criminal energy, and what you do with these. So it's very, very difficult to have one particular strategy, but I think that we're probably all here agree that the situation at the moment isn't ideal by any means, and cries out for changes. Maybe just one thing about the two books, and I mean, you've argued against it yourself, so maybe I shouldn't say something about this, but I think that from the perspective of metaphors, I mean, I have distinguished between prison is X, that is associations with the prison, and X is a prison in which all sorts of situations like pregnancy or marriage or whatever are conceived of as a prison. But they are distinct cognitively, but actually they interfere with one another, because once you have associations with prison is despondency, prison is trauma, prison is this, that, or the other, inevitably when you say my relationship to my grandmother is imprisoning, you are thinking of one of these things or one of these aspects that you earlier associated with the prison. So the two actually interfere. And because one of you have also, I think, mentioned metonymy and the fact we have fetters and bars and so on associated with the prison. And I think that's because in cognitive metaphor studies, you actually don't really distinguish very much between metaphors and metonymies, or they're treated under the same cognitive pattern. And I think the important thing to notice is that when you when you use a metaphor, you're not only using just one concept and linking it to the other, but each of these areas has a lot of connotations which could be linguistically referred to as metonymic complements, and they all come in and affect what you're actually implying by using that metaphor. And so again, I think that actually one has to see that if you analyze it in great detail, you can sort of distinguish between these elements, but in the effect and affect that these metaphors generate, they're actually very, very similar. They belong together. They coalesce into one affectual effect. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Monika, thank you so much for your wonderful answers as well. We have a range of questions. I probably won't be able to ask them all, in fact, because we're already quite a bit over a time that we were going to end. But perhaps what I thought I would do, Monika, if this was okay with you, was group a couple together, and you can decide what you would like to answer, okay. And then we can finish up. So perhaps three that hang together, I think, somewhat. The first one from Anna Kotova. To what extent can literature humanize people in prison and counter the prevalent narrative that they are some kind of mythical monsters? How might literature do this differently to, for example, qualitative interviews? A second from Greta Olsen, taking up Lindsay's comments on the work that metaphors might do in challenging the carceral imaginary. She's wondering about how this might counter notions of being metaphored as a discriminatory and marginalizing practice used against minoritized groups such as migrants, women, blacks, people of color. And a third, also picking up a comment on prisoner life writing, to what extent does metaphor allow people with lived experience of prison to express the inexpressible, to give voice to an experience that is traumatic, de-individualizing, and difficult to describe to a non-prisoner readership?
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with Greta's comment, because she has, of course, worked on the metaphor of the prisoner as animal. And so obviously, there are very negative images and metaphors used by various ideological discourses against not only prisoners, but other people, xenophobic discourse, etc. And metaphors that emphasize the trauma of, among others, imprisonment are, of course, could be conceived of as countering these kinds of metaphors. So I'm very much in agreement with that. As for people in prison reading literature, yes, this is, of course, all these programs of writing in prison and literature in prison. I think that's a fabulous thing, although I find, at least from my reading experience, that a lot of the time, also people just need to start to learn how to read and how to write, because, well, they're not entirely illiterate, but they're certainly not literate on a very high level. And but that's a first step. And I think that a lot of good has come from these kind of courses. And I think a lot of writers have learned to write in prison and become writers. And of course, there are whole collections in the United States of people's writing in prison. So I think that is very beneficial and very much, I think, would not just help people to face the responsibility for what they've done, but also to give them positive horizon, positive hopes for what they could achieve once they actually get out of prison. So I think that's extremely important. And yes, I mean, I think not just the metaphors, but also the topoi, help people to write down what they have experienced, what they otherwise couldn't have written out, not because it's necessarily ineffable, but also because a lot of people haven't encountered this kind of, haven't had this kind of experience before. And so they don't know how to deal with it, how to conceptualize it. So you could call this the trauma of finding oneself in this situation. And then how do you write about it? And having already texts about prison that you can use, I think might be extremely useful and help to articulate what you're feeling. The question is whether you can actually articulate what you are really feeling, because I think the problem is really in the conceptualization of finding out what's going on, particularly if it's not sort of retrospective, but more or less continuous with the experience. I don't know whether that answers the questions, but that's my response.
Well, that's great. I have a couple more, and as a last round, if you like, and we'll finish there. So Simon Stern, who I think is one of your co-editors of the series in which you published, has asked, pointed to the sometimes counterintuitive uses to which the metaphorics of incarceration have been put in your book. So the prisoner's world as prison, for instance, itself seems to encompass a remarkable amount. And he's wondering if these metaphorics have provoked you to consider some other leading metaphorics that have been explicitly offered as alternatives or contrasting possibilities, or perhaps that have appeared in ways that do complementary work. There also is a question from Isabel Ruolo, where she's wondering about how you recognize prison imagery or the carceral imaginary when you see it. For instance, does it include the locked door or the high wall as well as the cell? And there was a question about metonymy from David Gurnham, although you alluded to that relationship already. So perhaps those two questions, and then we'll finish.
I think I'll start with the second. This is easier to answer that. Well, I read a lot of text, and then I found out about various topoi and various metaphors. And I then went on to look at databases and use these keywords, and got a lot of material, and then sort of checked whether they had a prison context connected to them. And definitely walls and windows and bars were part of this number of texts that I used. And it was entirely interesting because I actually discovered texts I hadn't known of before at all. So an example is, for instance, D.H. Lawrence's short story, The Captain Stole, which I hadn't ever read before. And it was thanks to the database that I discovered that this is a key text. And the same is true for Mary Chumley's novel Prisoner. And she used to be very, very famous at the beginning of the 20th century, but now she's basically unknown except to, I think, feminist studies scholars. And there was this novel, and it's full of these prison metaphors and also prison scenarios. So this was thanks to the databases that I discovered that, and then it's really like reading the text and discovering the context. So when you actually discover the reference to, let's say, cage, then you really have to read not just the sentence in which the word cage occurs, but really the paragraph. And very frequently I ended up reading the text because it wasn't clear even from the paragraph, is this or is this not a prison image? Thanks to Simon for the question. I'm really not quite sure what I should answer here. So contrasting possibilities or complementary metaphors of complementary work. So I'm not sure whether you're thinking about other prison metaphors or metaphors that don't deal with prison that also occur in these texts. So I think metaphors that also occur in these texts, which are not about prison, I think there are obviously quite a lot of them, and they may be from a variety of different areas and connotations, but they may come together with the prison metaphor. So you could have metaphors about nature, for instance, or metaphors about work, where it doesn't necessarily shade off into slavery, metaphors about sunlight, for instance. So I think that happens a lot, but I wonder to what extent they are complementary. I mean, they are complementary in the sense that they actually add to the overall effect, but perhaps I've concentrated too much on the prison theme to see in what way metaphors might actually counteract the prison connotation. So thanks for pointing that out. So the next time I look at texts, I might pick up on that. Thank you.
Well, I think we'll all look forward to that. I hope we'll keep you to that promise, Monika.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've worked you quite hard, but I enjoyed it a lot myself. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Hanneke, Lindsay, and Alan for your great comments, and to all of you for your questions. I hope, Monika, there will be an opportunity for you to come and visit us at Queen Mary in person, and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody. It's been wonderful questions and wonderful to discuss the book. And yes, I do hope we'll do it in person as well at some point. Thank you.